This is Brookes coming at ya the last week of November to talk about our November 2020 book club book, which is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Daré. This book has been super popular. It was a Today Show book club pick in February. We read it this month. Shout out to Megan for helping me select it. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. There will be spoilers on this podcast, so I will quickly read I have a hardcover, so it's the inside flap, so you know what the book is about, and you can go and read it before you listen to our discussion, which again will include spoilers. So here is the inside flap of The Girl with the Louding Voice. Aduni is a 14-year-old Nigerian girl who knows what she wants. An education. The only daughter of a broke father, she is a valuable commodity. Removed from school and sold as a third wife to an old man, Aduni finds that her life amounts to this: 4 goats, 2 bags of rice, some chickens, and a new TV. When unspeakable tragedy swiftly strikes in her new home, she is secretly sold as a domestic servant to a household in the wealthy enclaves of Lagos, where no one will talk about the strange disappearance of her predecessor, Rebecca. No one but Aduni. As a yielding daughter of a subservient wife and a powerless servant, Aduni is repeatedly told that she is nothing. But Aduni won't be silenced. She is determined to find her voice, in a whisper, in song, in broken English, until she can speak for herself. For the girls like Rebecca who came before, and for all the girls who will follow. Featuring a remarkable, unforgettable heroine, Abby Daré's incredible debut novel is a heartbreaking coming-of-age story that vividly captures a young woman's courageous struggle for the right to choose her own future. And now I give you our discussion of The Girl with the Louding Voice. Thanks for listening. Hello, welcome to Books with Brookes. This is Brookes. I'm here today with my friend Carrie. Hi, Carrie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, thanks for being here. We are talking about our November 2020 book, which is called The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Daré. I finished it the day of book club, which was last week. I really pushed it. I don't usually do that, but I've been back on my having trouble focusing kick. I don't know why. In the beginning of the pandemic, I really couldn't read. And then I kind of got over it this summer. And then for some reason, since the holidays have begun, I've been like too fidgety to sit and read or something.
That's probably a common thing for a lot of people, especially around the holidays. There's just so many things to think about, especially this year.
Yeah, I think so too. And I just like keep wanting to get up and like putter around the house and like, I don't know, bake brownies or whatever. So anyway, I really pushed it, which I was wondering, like, is it because I didn't like the book? And I don't think so. Like I did want to read it. I just had a really hard time like sitting down and doing it. And so I don't know what that says, because I still rate this book highly and I give it a thumbs up, but I don't know why I had trouble reading it.
Got it. So it didn't actually take you a long time to read once you got into it, or it did take you a long time, or it was just like...
No, I thought it was pretty fast. I just had trouble like I started it like weeks before I finished it, and it just was like, I don't know. But I did really like it, and usually that's one of my biggest metrics of like, did I look forward to sitting down and reading? And this one feels really weird to me because I did look forward to sitting down and reading, but I still had trouble sitting down and reading. I don't know. Blame the pandemic.
Yeah, I was thinking there's a lot of extenuating circumstances going on.
Yeah. Did you like the book?
I did like the book. I did like it. I read it very quickly. I read it within like a few days.
Yeah.
I did look forward to reading it. At first, I was like a little, I think, jaded, like, oh, here comes another story of a girl overcoming, like just another story of a girl, overcoming boundaries and obstacles to get to a certain place. And I just didn't want it to be this typical fairy tale that is a very, like, I don't know, just an archetype that I feel like I've seen before. but
Yeah.
there was a lot of substance to the story. So I felt like I was like, oh, this is actually very interesting. Like I'm learning a lot. And even though it ended up turning out in a positive way, which is kind of like what I thought the story would do anyway, it wasn't as like I didn't see it coming as much as I thought I would.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that is an interesting point about like I didn't want this to be a fairy tale. Like that's a good point. But I also was like so many bad things happened to this main character. I was like really ready for her to like have a windfall. Like she needed a stroke
Yeah,
of good luck like badly.
absolutely. Yeah, and when her stroke of good luck comes, I was like, oh, okay, thank goodness. Like she is going to, come out of this life that she has and all of these bad things that have happened, and she's going to be able to like pursue education. That's really great. But then in the back of my mind, and I talked to Jeff about this, I was like, how many girls like don't get that stroke of luck, and they
Oh
just
yeah.
end up in this horrible place where they're
Yeah.
basically stuck in slavery, like
Yeah.
domestic slavery or servitude. And I was like, ooh, this is a really good story because she gets out of it, but like it did kind of hit home from a realistic standpoint. Like
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of girls maybe don't get that lucky strike.
Mhm, definitely. Well, I mean, certainly not. Like even that scholarship that she just happened to learn about and like it was really hard to apply for. Like how many domestic servants are going to even be able to apply, let alone like qualify to win? And did it say how
Right.
many they were giving out? How many of those scholarships? I think it was like 10.
I
It
think,
was
yeah, I
not
was
very
gonna say
many.
it seemed very few. And to your point, I was thinking, maybe women or girls in her position may learn some English, but the part that got me was like writing an essay. And that can be like, there's one thing to be able to speak like conversationally, but be able to write an essay would be just like another step of advancement that could be quite hard for people, especially that are just like working in the domestic industry.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um mhm. What do you think are the major themes of this book?
Hmm. I mean, I think the obvious ones would be, overcoming obstacles,
Yeah.
remaining optimistic, knowing
Mhm.
who you are and what you stand for. Um, I think a big one, especially for this book, and it seemed like that may be a cultural thing, was really the role of the man. Like the role of the man as the person who like determines the life of his daughters, basically oversees the life of his wife, and how the man, whether it's father or husband, has so much power, whether
Yeah.
for better or for worse. I was like,
I
that
mean,
was
seems like
really
for
quite
worse
crazy. Yeah, yeah,
in most
in
of
this
these
situation.
stories.
Yeah,
The men were not making they weren't making choices for the women. They were making choices for themselves, like to benefit themselves,
right. But
not to
their
benefit
choices
the broader
are
family or the women in the family.
right. But then it was like their choices are for themselves, but they seem to fail to recognize that their choices do affect like everyone around them, especially the women. And they just like kind of cast off like whatever repercussions happen to other people like don't matter. It just matters what happens to them, which is very self-centered.
Yeah, definitely. Well, like her dad, Aduni's dad, like sells her so that he can pay his own rent. And like
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. Like it didn't matter that she had to get sold and stop going to school and like marry an old man. All that mattered was that he was going to get like food and money for himself.
Yeah. Yeah. That part was horrible. And it was doubly awful because Aduni's mom, I think on her deathbed, was like to her father, promise me that you'll keep Aduni in school. Like, that's all that matters. Make sure she gets an education. He's like, yes, yes, I will. And then she passes
Yeah,
away.
like
And then
2
it's
months
like all
later
that
he's
went
like,
on.
"Never
Yeah.
mind."
Yeah.
Yeah. Ugh.
And I liked what Aduni said. She was like very she was very passionate, or she was very like into the fact that she saw her dad break a promise and was like, whoa, because he broke that promise, like, how can I ever trust him? Like, it was like he
Yeah.
had really broken something within her.
Yeah. And that actually seemed like, well, I mean, I guess we could debate all day like what we think actually would have happened to her had she not run away. But I was
Mm.
happy to see her like learn that lesson. Like, okay, this guy isn't trustworthy, because I feel like a lot of women in that position would have just like gone along, and been like, "Oh,
Yeah,
it's my like he didn't make the right call last time, but he will this time." And it's like, "No, he probably won't." Like it doesn't seem like he's the kind of person that will. I'm glad she learned that and remembered that this time.
absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It makes me really sad though, because I
Oh
think
yeah.
a lot of times women want to believe the best in people and want to believe the best in their fathers or their husbands, but then it's like, fool me once, shame on me, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And it's like she learned really fast, I think, with her dad, like you said. But it's sad that that doesn't always happen. And it's like people want to believe that, there is good in this person, but like then when they're kind of let down by that, it's just so disappointing.
Yeah. Some of the other themes people mentioned at book club were perseverance, which you said, like overcoming obstacles, courage. They said sexism, which I think you were also talking about, the position of men,
Yeah.
the arguably unfair weight that the male carries in the family system in Nigeria and in this book. And then also education, which I watched a video with the author, and it seemed like for her that was one of her like kind of guiding principles for the book, was to talk about how education can transform someone's life, someone who's poor. If you can learn English in Nigeria and you could sort of bootstrap yourself into a better position theoretically.
Mhm.
And that seemed really important to her, according to this Penguin Random House YouTube interview that I watched, which is pretty cool. And the author herself is Nigerian. She studied, she has a number of degrees from European universities, so she left Nigeria. And then I believe this book was published as a result, like she wrote it for a creative writing course. She was getting a creative writing degree and she wrote this book for class, and then it won an award as like an unpublished manuscript. So before it
Mm.
was ever published, and then it was published after that, which so is kind of an unconventional, I think, like route to becoming a New York Times bestseller. This is a splashy book. It was a Today Show pick. Um, I think in February, and has been getting a lot of attention. So I think probably one of the reasons is that the way that it uses language, um, and the writing and speaking style in this book, which is, I think, really unusual because, we're in a Dooney's head. She's our narrator, and everything we get is from her perspective. So it's in her broken English. So I think that's unusual because typically, when you read a book about a character who doesn't speak English very well, you have a narrator who's speaking normal English, and then you might get some thoughts in their head or like dialogue in that dialect. But this book
Mhm.
was the whole thing. And some people in book club really hated that. It was kind of hard to read at times. It took a lot more, I think, time and interpretation, um, than a book written differently. But I feel like that's what makes this book really special and very spectacular. Um, so, what did you think, Carrie, of the use of language and how this book was written?
Yeah, so it took a couple of sentences for me to realize, like, oh wait, hold on. Okay, this let me I had to like read the first couple sentences a couple of times just to make
Yeah,
sure I
me too.
understood.
Yeah,
First off, this is like someone speaking, and like, okay, we're in like the main character's head. Um, I think it did take a little bit of getting used to, but ultimately, I really appreciate the mechanism that the author used in order to give the reader a real visual and understanding from Aduni's point of view, like what was happening. Because I feel like there were times in the book where she was interpreting a situation in her own head, but as a reader, being a little bit more, um, I don't know what the word is. Like we had a different perspective and therefore we could tell. Like for example, when she first starts working at the house and Coffee is like, you got to watch out for Big Daddy, like never be alone with him. And you hear from her like, why? Like,
Mm-hmm.
like she just doesn't understand, but like
Mm-hmm.
already from the reader's point of view, you get a little bit of an inkling of like, oh, okay, like
This is
there
gonna
may
be
be some
trouble.
like shady stuff, yeah,
Yeah.
happening with Big Daddy,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't really see that from a Dooney's point of view. You just have to kind of make that own assumption on your own, and then it comes out to be true. It happens a couple of times, and I think it was a really interesting way to characterize a Dooney because I think you realize how young she is and how
Yeah.
inexperienced
She's
she is and
so
how
young.
naive she is.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Super
she's
naive.
like, I think 14 or 15,
Mm-hmm.
and she only has completed a certain amount of schooling. And it's just really interesting to see her kind of shoved into these situations of real life and, very difficult times, like with her mom dying and then just having to be on the run and then having to be a servant to this woman who really doesn't appreciate her and doesn't treat her well. And she learns all these lessons, but hearing them happen like in her own voice, I feel like made me really appreciate the struggle and the growth that she actually had to go through to get to where she wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the language does evolve, I think, which I had hoped it did. When we first started off, I was like, oh man, I really hope she like learns better English through this book and we get to see that happen because that would be really cool. Also, it will be easier on me as the reader.
Yeah,
And that does happen, although I would argue not until really the very, very end of the story.
yeah,
I think for me, that could have come a little sooner, but I understand, the arc of the story, etc. Um,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, we had some book club members who didn't like that, who thought it just made it really difficult to read, and I do wonder, like when I'm thinking about why it took me so long to finish this book, if that's why, if just it was just more work to read, even though it was
yeah,
enjoyable and beautiful and incredible and I loved the story and I loved the characters. It was just more work. It was like watching a really good film with subtitles or something. Like you really really
yeah.
enjoy it and it's an amazing movie, like Parasite, which this book actually reminded me of a lot. um
Ooh, good call. I didn't think of that.
yeah, Parasite, because it's got this like class warfare thing going on and like an eat the
Yeah.
rich sort of message, and but you have to read the subtitles. So it's like this movie's going to be some work for me, but I'm going to love it, but I have to stay awake and I've got to be really alert and like, I think it was kind of the
You
same.
gotta be in the mood for it. You gotta be like, all right, I'm ready, like I feel like doing this right now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to talk about. I do think this book is worth I think it will be high on my recommendations list because it's so unusual for that reason. And I think it's a challenging book to read and a really interesting and very different book to read. So it's worth people picking up, in my opinion.
I agree.
Um, so on page 23, this is really early in the story. Aduni is at home, her mother is still alive, and we get a visit from someone called Mr. Abe or Mr. Abbey. Um, and he just comes and is like, wants to see Aduni's mom, but her mom isn't there. And she says, oh, sorry, he is not here. And he's like, okay, well, tell her I stopped by. And that's basically it. That's all we get. Later, we find out that he was her mom's, sort of like the love of her mom's life, who she wasn't allowed to get married to because of her station. So his family thought like she wasn't good enough for him, basically. But he's like a very fancy guy, speaks amazing English. He drives a fancy car. She's really like impressed by him, Aduni. So my question is, what was the significance of that character and why did we meet him at all? Because he never comes back in the book. Um,
Hmm.
I thought maybe, eventually he would like save her or help her or be her connection with the abroad. And he wasn't, he didn't, and he like never comes back. So I'm kind of wondering, I'm left wondering like what is the significance of that character and why did we need to meet him at the start of the story?
That's a really good question. I didn't think of that. Now that you mention it, I did kind of think along those same lines. Like
Yeah.
he's an introduction to a character that's going to play a pivotal role in her life. Um I don't know. I'm not sure what the role is. I think he did shine some light on a couple of things, and that was just the difference in, the way Aduni's family lived and where, maybe what their house looked like, how much money they had, and maybe where their socioeconomic status stood compared to someone who, studied abroad and has a nice car. Because I think from the book, like she talks about how they all like their house is very small. They cook in this one room. Like their house is just very um like rudimentary. And if they like earn enough money, maybe someday they'll be able to buy like a certain kind of metal to put on the roof just so
Yeah.
that they have like a roof that doesn't leak. And when I hear those things, I think, wow, like they're really living in a way that is, their house is like borderline like inside outside, like there doesn't seem to be any real protection. But I didn't like really understand how hard her home life was
Yeah.
until it was like really juxtaposed against someone who, I mean, fortunately for people like me and you who like, we have access to a car and we have a roof over our heads. Like myself reading this book, I felt like, oh, like, we would be, and my peers would be more in tune with the way the guy's life was. And it just gave me perspective, like, wow, Aduni's life and family is really, really like, they're really roughing it.
Yeah.
Um, Also, I think it showed that as much as Aduni seemed to like worship her mom and really revere like the things that she taught and her, her emphasis on education, it kind of showed that like Aduni didn't really know everything about her mom and that her mom still was like a person outside of just being her mother. Like she had her own
Yeah.
life and she
Yeah.
had, other people that she didn't know about in her
That's a
life
good
that were
point.
important. And I thought that was interesting because a lot of times I think maybe up until a certain age, a lot of people think of like their mom and dad as like they're my mom or dad. But then it's like, well, they were people before they were your mom and dad. Like, they're also just adults. And it was interesting for Aduni to realize that. I feel like it gave her a little bit of realism. Um, as much as she loved her mom, I think it made her, just kind of start the wheels in her head to thinking about like there can be more to life than like just what I see. Cause I love my mom. I thought I know her, but like there's apparently this guy that's like, I think she couldn't even understand how her mom would know someone like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true.
It's kind
Yeah,
of
because he was
funny.
like an alien, like he seemed so removed from their lives.
Hey, it's JD from the Hyman Podcast. Using a narrative storytelling approach, the Hyman Podcast was created to start conversations. Conversations that need to be human. Week by week, I'll break down walls and barriers and make people wildly uncomfortable, all the while giving a voice to the voiceless and the marginalized. Consider this your personal invitation to be part of that conversation.
Hey everyone, it's Cameron Justice, co-host of the Orange is Orange or Browns podcast. Make sure you check us out for everything Browns. We got you covered before the game, after the game. Here are our takes, here are our feedback, here are our criticisms, and our praises. If you like the Browns, you're going to love this podcast.
So sort of the inciting action that causes Aduni to run away. I thought she was going to run away initially when she was getting sold to be the third husband of the local taxi driver, but she doesn't. She goes through with the wedding. She's a good girl. She moves in with him, becomes like low man on the totem pole in this new household where they are really quite abusive to her. But she has actually a really healthy and good relationship with the second wife, Khadijah. And
Mhm.
but then Khadijah dies in childbirth, and Aduni is afraid she's going to be blamed for the death because she was there, and so she runs away in order to keep from like letting the chief of the village kill her, which seems like a really possible outcome given the situation, which is insane. So she runs away. She runs to the family friend who her mom has kind of taken care of, this old woman in a nearby village. And the old woman calls her brother, I think, Mr. Cola. And Mr. Cola shows up, and the old woman's like, you got to help her. She can't go back to her village. Get her a job. Can you get her a job? And he's like, well, I guess so. Yeah, I got her a job. So what are our feelings on Mr. Cola? Is he trustworthy? Is he a good person? Does he help Aduni, or does he harm her? Because I mean, essentially human traffics her into a slave labor position in Lagos at Big Madam's house. But he also keeps her from getting, murdered in her own village for a death she didn't commit. So anyway, I feel he's worth maybe discussing, because he also steals her wages, we assume. And like kind of never comes back to check on her again. I don't know. Like, what's the deal with Mr. Cola? What do we think of him?
I don't know. It's very conflicting, because I totally agree. Yeah, he essentially sells her into domestic slavery. He steals her wages. He promises to come back. He never comes back. It's like, those are all really bad things. At the same time, he does have this sort of loyalty and honor to his sister to like fulfill his promise of like, yeah, I'll get her out of here and I'll get her a job. So I don't know. When I think about Cola, I think about something that I've heard and I don't have experience with, but people who are sometimes in, maybe certain neighborhoods, or they're born into an area of the world with not much opportunity. Unfortunately, they're not bad people, but they are kind of forced to pursue whatever avenues of opportunity they have. And sometimes they're not the most honest avenues. And although they may try to be good people, like maybe they end up selling drugs because that's the only thing that, I think that Cola is ultimately trying to do some good, but he also like seems to need to take care of himself. So does he like steal her wages because he needs to eat too?
Right.
Or does he never show up because he knows that he stole her wages and so he can't come back even though he promised he would? So I feel like he's doing bad things. A part of me seems a little sympathetic towards him, because it just seems like there isn't that, like, unless you get an education and go to university, it seems like in the world that Aduni lives in, there really isn't that much that can get you out of your socioeconomic status very quickly, no matter like what you try to do.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
So I don't know if that means, he's forced to do these bad things. It seems like he could maybe be a little bit of a better person and not make promises he can't keep. At the same time, it's hard for me to really judge, because this world that they're in is very different than anything I can imagine.
That's for sure. Yeah. Well, and also he, when we first heard the name Big Madam, I was like, oh no. Like this is a sex situation. She's going to be a sex slave. And so that's what I was afraid he was taking her into. And then when it was just a domestic, I say just, obviously her situation was awful, and Big Madam is a complicated character as well. But I was relieved that it wasn't like a brothel, which is what I thought it was going to be. So then I was kind of like, oh, well, he did bring her to be a maid. Like, that's what he said he would do. Okay, not so bad, not so bad. Even though, he took all her money and she never got paid, and the lady of the house beat her horrifically. So,
right.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I feel complicated about him, but I also, and we talked about Big Madam a lot in book club, which I thought was really fun, because I think she's also a really complicated and deep character of the kind that I think we rarely see in books. Like, she is horrible. She's awful to Aduni. She's objectively like a mean, cruel boss, But she's also a
Mhm.
self-made woman who started with nothing and now runs like one of the most successful businesses in Lagos. She also like they have real moments of like intimacy and empathy and understanding between each other. Um, she does like she does try to protect Aduni from Big Daddy. She doesn't really try that hard, but she does. I don't know. I think Big Madam is a really, really interesting character. And you do, like, despite how awful she is to Aduni, you root for her in the end. Like, you really, really want her to, like, come into her own and kick Big Daddy out and, like, stand on her own 2 feet and, like, be her own woman. Like, I really felt myself rooting for her, even though she's kind of the villain of the story.
Absolutely. No, that's a great way to put it. She's a villain for a lot of the story, especially when Aduni like first comes to her house. The
Yeah.
thing about Big Madam that really made me think was like, what kind of like lessons did she learn in life to feel that this is how she needs to treat others? Or how, like she also takes a lot of like abuse from her husband who's like knowingly cheating on her and like
Yeah.
doesn't work and spends all her money. I'm like, in what world did she grow up in to like think that this is okay? Like, for him to just like treat her like horribly and she not to stand up for herself, and then for her to also like treat others horribly.
Yeah.
It made me kind of sad because I was like, is there a lesson here in that, this type of society in some way, I don't know, like, sometimes you hear that like people who are abused end up abusing others because
Mm-hmm.
it's not something that they find uncommon because it happened to them,
Yeah.
but it is really wrong. And so it's like this horrible cyclical process. And
Yeah.
I was totally rooting for her in the end, but she said something that was really poignant, which was, she said something along the lines of like, I'd rather have a horrible husband like him than be a woman with no husband.
Yeah.
Like no matter how awful he was.
It's so sad.
She was like, basically in this world, like I need to have a man with me or I'm nothing no matter how much I've accomplished, which is so sad.
Yeah, it's really sad. Like, normalize being single worldwide, please.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's
And
sad.
to your point, yeah, she was a self-made woman and she had a phenomenal business that was really successful, but it was like, that doesn't mean anything if you have a husband, even if he has no job, cheats on you, and like spends all your money.
Yeah. I mean, he's awful.
Yeah, he was awful.
I saw a TikTok recently that was like it was like whenever I hear people complaining about like rising divorce rates, I remind them that women couldn't get credit cards until the 1970s. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's so true. Like, women worldwide, including in the United States, uh have to stay in marriages that are unhealthy or bad or that make them unhappy because they can't support themselves because the system
Yeah,
is designed so that they cannot. Ugh, it's really
it
frustrating.
makes me so mad.
Yeah, it's terrible. Especially because like Big Madam was clearly like a dope business lady. Like, she was an
Yeah,
incredible salesperson. She had this eye for it all. She worked really, really hard, like threw herself into it, and doesn't get any of the credit.
yeah,
Bummer.
I know. And she's like villainized even while her husband is like sneaking off and like having these affairs.
Yeah.
She's the bad guy,
Right.
even though he's really bad too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's just almost nothing redeemable about Big Daddy at all.
No, nothing.
Yeah. He's barely even worth talking about. But I did think Big Madam, and when we talked about this in book club, like, it's really interesting because just a really interesting character. And one that I really enjoyed reading. So
She
that
was
was,
very unpredictable.
yeah, she was
There
extremely.
were times where I was like, "Oh my gosh, like, is she gonna explode at a Dooney right now, or is she going to, like, be okay with this?"
Yeah.
She was very hard to read.
Yes. Um, okay, so once a Dooney is in Big Madam and Big Daddy's house, she is obviously responsible for cleaning, and she cleans for like 12 hours a day. And they have a library, and she's always having to dust the books in the library. So she starts trying to read them, sneak little reads of all these books. And at that point, which starts on chapter 28, we begin to have chapters that start with little prefaces that are facts about Nigeria. And they come from something called the Book of Nigeria Facts, which we learn later in the author's note is not a real book, which is a bummer because I want it. I'm like trying to read all the Nigeria facts now. But so the chapters begin to start with Nigeria facts. And I thought that was really interesting and kind of a big shift in the book for me. And I really liked it because I felt like I was learning about Nigeria alongside Aduni and really like sort of expanding my own knowledge of the country, which I will admit is extremely limited. And I thought that was like a fun addition. Didn't have anything to do with the story. Like the facts were sometimes random. They were sometimes contextual, but I don't know. What did you think about the facts? Were there any that stood out to you as really interesting or relevant?
Yeah, I thought I also thought it was really interesting because my knowledge of Nigeria and its history was also extremely limited. So I thought it was just really interesting to hear about this country and culture that I knew pretty much nothing about. There was one that was about what Aduni calls, I think, jungle justice, and how jungle justice was this this way, I guess, for certain tribes or areas to basically self-govern. But at times, the way that they self-governed was quite conservative and based off of very old religious and spiritual ideas that were no longer really recognized from a national standpoint. And so there was one fact that was like jungle justice was actually abolished or was, now said to be illegal from this year on. Yet a lot of small villages and tribes still adhered to that. And I think Aduni really has her eyes open because she was thinking, I essentially ran away because I was afraid of what this book is calling jungle justice. And I just thought that that's just the way things are. This second wife of the man that she's forced to marry dies in childbirth. She's present. And, in this very old and backward way of thinking, because she's present, it would just be assumed that being the third wife underneath this woman in the household stature, that she would obviously have had the motive to kill her because it's just generalized that, the third wife would be jealous of the second wife
Yeah.
and she probably would like do that.
Yeah.
And there's just no leeway or mention of like individual rights or opinion.
Yeah.
Like if anyone looked at it, they'd be like,
there's no like, they're not going to investigate. There's not
yeah,
going to call a
no.
doctor. Yeah.
Right. And it would have just been like, well, she was the third wife. Obviously, she killed the second wife because she was jealous. And like, that's going to be the law of the land. And we're going to have to like kill Aduni. And she essentially runs away in that fear. And I thought that was a really interesting point because it also gave the reader kind of a concept of like, even though there's national law, there's still a lot of areas in this country that still stick to very, old ways of thinking. And it also kind of comes up when you talk about like the educational piece of this book, how a lot of the men, like her father, think, girls don't have to go to school. Their education doesn't mean anything as long as they get married off and are able to have kids, especially boys.
Yeah.
Like that's the way that
Twin
they can
boys.
secure their place in life. Yeah. Twin boys. As long as they have boys, like that'll be the way they can secure themselves in life.
Yep.
Which in today's society, like especially from a Western standpoint, that is not the way we think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I kind of went off on a tangent, but I don't know. There's a lot of things about this book that are really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It really was like, it reminded me, a couple of the scenes really reminded me of like the Hunger Games when like Aduni is like basically from like District 13 and everyone else is from district, the capital or whatever. And she's like describing them as if they're like basically aliens. Like they do their hair in this insane way. They wear these insane clothes that are so expensive. The way that they eat is different. Like everything about them is different from her. And it's so, yeah, just the difference between like poverty and having money. It's very sad.
Yeah, or even like rural versus urban in this country. Very largely different.
Yeah. Like the cook coffee is like one of the only reasons I work here is because I've got this like top of the line Smeg range. I'm like, ooh, those are nice. Meanwhile, Aduni has never even seen running water before. Like, what? She's never
Right.
seen, and I mean, that was sort of jarring to me because when you read the first part of the book and you're in the village where she is from, I thought the book was set in like the 80s. But then you realize at
Mhm.
some point when she gets to Lagos that, oh no, it's 2015 and this is a modern day story. Like that was like a big revelation and like, oh wow, like this is really, really a different world.
Yeah,
Even though it's modern.
right.
Crazy. Yeah.
It's interesting because also Dooney in the beginning of the book, like even though she has a lot of hardships and she's not sure like what's gonna happen, like I got the overall sense that she was like really sad her mom passed away. But in general, like a normal like girl in the village, like relatively happy, like doing her best, going about life, only to realize I'm like, oh my gosh, like she's never even seen running water.
Yeah. I know. What?
Like,
Yeah,
I
and
don't
they didn't have
know,
electricity
really
and stuff.
perspective.
Yeah. Okay, I want to read one of my favorite sentences in the book, which is on page 223. So Aduni is working with Miss Tia, who is teaching her English, which side note, we talked about this at book club, but I was so stressed out by the way that they approached this essay, which was not like we have 2 weeks, why don't you start writing it?
Oh
It
my
was
gosh,
like,
I agree.
oh, I know. We'll start at the very beginning and I'll teach you your ABCs. And in 2 weeks, you'll be ready to write an essay that will change the course of your entire life. I was like, what are you guys doing? Like, no, write the essay. Start right now.
That's
So
exactly how
stressful.
I felt.
Ugh. And then she finally writes the essay. She just like slips it under the door. I'm like, no, put it in her hands. Like, postmark it. Like, sign it in blood. Oh, man.
Yeah.
Scary.
And I was like, I know. And when she drops the letter off, I was like, you're not even going to have her proofread it.
I know.
Like, you're not going to have like look over it with her and then be like, okay, this is the official version. Like,
He's like,
it
no,
was
we've done 6 hours of English lessons. I'm sure it's perfect. It's like, what? No.
right.
Also, I really, really
I,
wanted to read the essay. I wish the essay had been included in the book
mm,
because I wanted to read it. Obviously, like we knew what was in it. The book tells us like what the contents were, but I wanted to like read the words she wrote and how she
yeah, that's a good
like was able
point.
to express herself in a way that was gonna like win her a scholarship. We
True.
don't
That
get
would
to
have
it.
been a good part.
But so this is from this on page 223, one of my favorite sentences is from when Miss Tia and Aduni are doing an English lesson. And Miss Tia corrects her and says, how is mine different from yours, Aduni? Different, not differenting. Then she teach me the different in her own different and my own differenting. And that's the sentence. I love it so much. It's so cute and
So
funny and
it is
sweet and
cute.
like naive and still incorrect. Um, then she teach me the different in her own different and my own differenting. Like somehow for me,
She's
that's like the
so
theme of this
cute.
whole book. Like everyone's different. We're all differenting and we've got to figure out the difference between our differenting.
Yes, exactly. And the differences are like so large.
Yeah. Yeah, they feel insurmountable a lot of times. Yeah. I mean, I feel like there are a million sentences similar to this one that we could pick apart and talk about and dissect and really enjoy. In this book, it's one of the things that makes it so unique and beautiful. But that was one of my very favorites.
I
Um,
like that one.
I feel like our conversation so far, Carrie, has been really light. But I asked a question at book club, like, do you think this book is a sad book or a hopeful book?
Hmm. I don't know. There are a lot of really sad parts
Yes.
and really dark parts,
Yes.
especially when you think about Aduni's young life and her prospects and where she ends up. Um, is this, well, I guess I would say overall, it is a hopeful book just because, she does end up winning the scholarship. She will be able to go on and study, and she she does, claw her way out of this horrible circumstance, which seems partially out of luck because she would never have heard about the contest if not for her coworker Coffee. But also, I mean, she does work really hard at her English, and she does have this very innate sense from her mom of like education being important and being a way out of just like a really simple life. So I would say it's overall hopeful for the ending.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of really sad parts
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah. I think this book, and again, this is probably why I struggled with reading it, is that it is really, really sad and really, really dark for a solid 4/5 of the book.
Mhm.
And I think, Aduni's outlook is hopeful, and so we can kind of come away with it as being a hopeful book, and it has a bit of a happy ending. But yeah, I felt a little bit about this book. I don't know if you ever saw The Revenant, that like Leonardo DiCaprio movie where he like sleeps inside of a bear. I don't know. It
I
got a lot
do,
of
but
Oscar buzz like in 2017. Anyways,
yeah.
it's truly just a list. It's just like all the worst things that can happen to a person in a row. And it's exhausting to watch. And I didn't like it. But this book was similar for me, which is just like bad thing after bad thing after bad thing after bad thing after bad thing happened to this poor girl. And then at the same time, the book is telling us like she's not unique. This is happening to millions and millions of girls in Nigeria and across the world every day. So I thought it was really a heavy, sad book in content, mostly.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess that's kind of what I was trying to say in the beginning of our conversation, where I was like, it made me realize like how many girls don't get this chance.
Yes.
And they just get stuck into this horrible life of serving a rich family or a rich person, which, I think is often maybe in the US something that may not be in front of our eyes, but it is, so widely common in other countries. It's really, that part is very, very sad.
Yeah.
And tough to read because it seems so unfair. Like, I feel like one of the big takeaways I had from this book was like, whoa, this girl is trying so hard. She's ready to do anything just to go to school. Like, how much did I take for granted just going to school?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like I come from a place where like everyone goes to school, at least like high school, like that's normal. And like it would be unheard of for not unheard of, but it would be very uncommon if someone, didn't finish high school. Yeah. And yet this girl, and, like I didn't do anything to like go to school. I didn't have to try to, ask my parents to let me go to school. And just to see her.
They have to send you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, in the US. True. Or I mean, I guess they could have homeschooled you, but like you have to go to school in some capacity in the United States. Yeah.
But it's like she has none of that protection at all. Like she has to really fight for what we have as just like basic normalcy.
Yeah. Yep. Well, this has been just as always, fantastic conversation. I love talking with you about books. It is one of my favorite things to do. And I am glad you liked this one. There's, as always, we could talk truly endlessly about this story, and we could read individual sentences, etc. But we won't because we're out of time. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about that I didn't bring up?
No, I think you had some really good questions. And yeah, absolutely. If anyone was thinking about reading this, I would say there are so many things to like think about from this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And someone said in book club, like that they loved reading this. Obviously the author is a person of color, which is great. And we love to support, diverse authors. So that's a reason to read it, but also it is, it's set in Nigeria, which is a place I haven't read many books set in Nigeria. So that was really interesting. It is definitely a book to broaden your horizons. Certainly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Carrie. I hope you have a lovely rest of your Sunday.
Thanks for having me, Brookes. Always fun to chat.
Yes. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Books with Brookes is in the Press Play Podcast Network, and our theme music is by Jonathan Allen.